Okay, in this video, I'm going to be going over Swagger, how we're using it, the different interfaces that you can access, or interface. Sorry, there's only one for Swagger. Um, the configuration of it, and what already exists, and how you can add things to our Swagger um, definitions file. So the first thing to note is that if you're watching this and it's a few months from now, right now it's December 2016, everything that you're seeing that I refer to as Swagger is probably referred to as OpenAPI now. They changed over to they changed the standard over to be called OpenAPI, but they're not actually naming anything OpenAPI until the next version comes out, which right now that has not happened. So the standard is still referred to as Swagger, as well as all of the tooling. In the future, all of the tooling will still be referred to as Swagger. However, the standard uh, will actually be called OpenAPI. So first, let me just describe what the difference is between the standard and the tooling. So the standard basically just dictates the format of the YAML file uh, for defining an API, for defining the documentation in particular. Uh, the tooling takes that definitions file and creates things like the routes. It creates a user interface for actually viewing the documentation. It also creates a method for actually testing the API from that interface. It's a web interface that you can read the documentation as well as actually execute the API calls to the endpoints. Uh, so now that I've just given a brief overview of the separation there, let's actually look at what that looks like. So in our project, I'm in the main repository. Everything that we're going to be concerned with is inside of this app directory. This app directory basically contains all of our code for the application that we're running. Everything outside of that is just support files for running the actual Docker environment for the project. So everything is going to be inside this app directory. Inside of that, we're just going to open up the main server.js file just so you can see how this is actually set up. So we're requiring two Swagger modules. One is just the Swagger tooling that integrates into the Express framework, and that tooling is the tooling that's actually creating the routes for us, so that we don't have to manually generate those inside of Express. We can just generate those on the fly based on the Swagger definitions file. The other is the Swagger UI. That's the actual module that's creating the user interface in the browser that you can go to do the documentation. And we'll actually look at what that looks like and what you can do with it a little later on in the video. Below that, we're requiring some files or some modules just so we can load and parse the Swagger definitions file, since Node.js does not include a YAML parser by default, and this is not JSON. So we do need to load that file in and then parse it. And that's just to be used by the UI. So the UI is taking the same file that we're using to describe the routes to actually generate the documentation, which that is the most amazing thing that Swagger provides, is one file to both do documentation as well as all these other things related to Express that would normally have to be done separately. All the other includes, we'll get to those in later videos that are not specific to Swagger in our case. Below that, we have the Swagger setup. So the first thing that we're doing is actually manually creating the route for the documentation. So we do still need to do that. So if we actually hit, and I have this running, so if you don't have the project running, then this URL is not going to work. But if you hit localhost/docs, you'll see Swagger documentation. I'm not going to get into all of these yet. We will once we actually see how it's being generated and what we can do with it. Down below that, you'll see some configuration settings for Swagger. That's for the Swagger Express module. So one thing that's required is the app root directory. These are not required, but these are our custom security handlers. You can use the built-in ones that Swagger comes with. I believe it provides OAuth authentication, as well as just a standard API key authentication or security. We will probably be moving to OAuth at some point, but we might still be wrapping it in our own custom module. So yeah, so you could just think of this as basically middleware that Swagger has access to use for any of its routes. Down below that, we're just doing the standard application listening. Below that, we're actually, so this is actually a function, so this is going to get called after Swagger actually does its setup. So here we're actually starting Swagger up. So we're creating a new Swagger Express instance and registering it. And then once that's complete, we do things related to our application, not specifically related to Swagger. And then once those things are completed, then the application actually starts listening on whatever port is defined. So let's get into some other Swagger related documents. So inside of the config directory, there's a default.yaml file, and that is the default file name for Swagger. Swagger just knows to use that as its default file, that config file. All of this is pretty standard. There haven't been any changes. The only changes that we might need to implement are if we actually change the directory locations for things like fittings, mocks, and controllers. There are some settings that need to be added or changed depending on what version of Swagger tooling we're using with Express. But that is described inside of the actual release documentation for that version of Swagger. Right now, I believe we are using 0.1. Let's just check really quick. Yeah, 0.1. I'm not sure what the latest version is, but this is the version that is recommended by the guys that create Swagger for Node right now. So that is what we are using. All right, let's get into the fun things. So inside of the API directory are all of the files related to our API, including the Swagger definitions and everything Swagger related. And inside of this API directory, there's a Swagger directory, which has the Swagger definitions file. Right now, it's only one file. Once we actually start developing in this project, it's probably going to be multiple files. But yeah, you can import as many definition files as you want, so there's no limit on us breaking this out into multiple files. So let's just go over what this is actually doing really quick. I'm not going to go over every route because this is really just test code. This is not application code that's going to be running on a production server or anything like that. This is just for us testing the environment out. So I'll just start at top and work my way down. So I've broken it up into sections based on this format of comments, so it makes it a little bit easier to scan the document and get into whatever section you actually need to manipulate, since a brunt of the content in this is going to be under the actual paths. So at the very top, we just have some general information about the project, or the API, I should say, the title, the version, and the description. So Swagger will let you, the Swagger standard will, if you put a pipe in at the very top in the description, it assumes that it's a multi-line description. So whenever you see that pipe on the first line, that's just indicating that there's going to be a multi-line description. Down below that section, we're defining the hostname. So this is important because that's what Swagger uses inside of UI for actually creating the links to the endpoints. So that should match however you're accessing the API. So if you're doing this on testing, then it should be testing.rentalforward.com. The base path, the schemes. So this could be HTTP and HTTPS. In this project, we push all of the traffic over HTTPS, so we're not even concerned with HTTP. So it's not even going to set up a route based on HTTP. Consumes, so this is what incoming data can be formatted as. the final project, this will probably be multiple versions so that we can accept XML data as well as JSON. Produces, so this is what the output of the API could be, the data types that it can be. Again, this might change to JSON and XML depending on where in the process we're actually changing data types. So we could provide some other piece of middleware, JSON, and that's actually the part that's responsible for the data conversion. But yeah, to be determined. So just know that, yeah, this is what's coming out, this is what's coming in. Down below that we have tags. So these tags, if you look in the UI screen that I have up right now, these tags correlate to these actual different little sections that we have. So it's just an easy way for us to organize similar paths under a single tag name. So even though the checks tag actually contains paths that are under multiple sections, so they're not all localhost/checks, we can still group them together under that because that's what makes the most sense. And then just brief descriptions. These are not multi-line descriptions, but they certainly could be if we need to have longer descriptions for each of these tags, and that's what's actually showing up here. So you can see that it probably doesn't make sense to do a really long description here because that text is fairly large. And this can all be manipulated. I mean, we can change the CSS here. This is just the boilerplate CSS styling that comes with that tooling. So down below that, we have the security section. So like I mentioned in the server.js file, we're defining these two security handlers, which are our own security handlers. And this is where we're actually referencing them. We're setting up the definition for use throughout the Swagger definitions file. So we're creating a user auth, which just, yeah, like it says here, has to match the actual user auth name here. If it didn't, then you get an error the first time that you try to run this. So what type is that? It's an API key, which is just Swagger's terminology for a key. Not necessarily just the API key, because as you can see, we have another API key as well. We're going to describe where that's located, so that's going to be in the header. So when we send a request to the endpoint, we're expecting a parameter with name auth to be in the header. And then below that, API auth is similar, just a different header name. So right here, I'm defining the default security settings to use for the project. So if there are no specific security settings provided for a path, it's going to revert to using these defaults. So this is basically saying that for every path or route, we're requiring them to both be authenticated against API auth as well as user auth. Now you could separate this if you wanted to. So this method would basically say they could be authenticated against either or. So they could be security again using their API key or their user authentication key. In our case, we want both. So we're defaulting to the highest level of security, and then we'll enter exceptions for the particular paths that we want lower versions of or lower levels of security. And you'll see how we do that once we get into the actual path definitions. Below the security settings, we have the parameters, or below the security section, we have the parameters section. This is where we're just defining different parameters that are going to get passed from the user back to the API, just so they can be reused easily without having to define this whole definition for every path that actually uses something like Couchbase ID, or even more so, to-do ID. So this parameter of to-do ID has a name of ID, so that's the name that we're expecting it to come over as from the user. It's located in the path, so that means that the path is going to look something like, let's type it in here really quick. It's going to look like something like test / ID number. Okay, so that's what path is indicating, that it's actually in the endpoint path. The description, again, we could have a multi-line description here if we needed to. Just putting a pipe on the first line will indicate that. The data type is a number. It is required whenever we're actually referencing this parameter of to-do ID. It's going to be a required parameter. It has to be a minimum length of 1 and the maximum of 10. Let's actually just change that to 11, since I think that's the standard for integers inside of MariaDB or MySQL. Couchbase ID. So Couchbase ID is a little bit different because Couchbase could use it's alphanumeric and it's user set, so it's not an automated. It's not an integer that gets incremented like most MariaDB and MySQL instances are set up to do. So it's still got a name of ID. It's still in the path, just like the to-do ID. We have our regular description here. However, the type is string. Since it is alphanumeric, it is required, and it's got a minimum length of 1, no maximum length, since it's user enterable. I'm not sure what the actual limit is for Couchbase. I haven't tested that limit, but in our case, for this test environment, we're just going to set it to a minimum length of 1 with no maximum. Below the parameter section, we have the largest path section. So this is where we're actually going to define all of our endpoints and the response codes, and yeah, well, you'll see as we get into it. So check. So this is just going to respond with a string. This is just used for integration testing, just so we can check to make sure that Node is actually serving requests. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense now that we've actually started doing unit tests, but it's been in here since this test anyway has been in here since the beginning for integration tests. So we moved it over. This is all test code that's going to get wiped out soon anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. So we define the path /check. Then we define something called the Swagger router controller. So that's where we're defining what controller to actually use for handling this request. Get that? So this is saying to use the checks controller. So if you noticed, inside of our configuration file, we had a definition for controllers. The controllers directory is API/controllers. So if we actually look inside of the controllers directory, we have a file that's called checks, and that's what that's actually referencing. So this is referencing that file name, just so you know. So if you set up a controller that's named ASD, there is no ASD, so you're going to get an error. So it's going to use checks. The response type, or the verb is get. You can have more than one verb type, as you'll see down. Couchbase, we have verb type of get, also a verb type of post, both under the same path. So yeah, any HTTP verb type, you can just look up a list of what those are, your normal CRUD operations. So underneath that verb type, we have a description of what the API is actually going to do using that verb at that path. The operation ID, so this actually matches what the function is inside of the controller. So if we're just going to open up this controller really quick. We'll go over these more in depth by themselves. So inside the checks controller, we have two module exports. We have check load balancer and check load. So if you look back at our Swagger definitions file, we're going to use the operation check load. So that's where you're actually defining which operation inside of the controller to use. And these operation IDs have to be unique. So check load operation ID cannot be used in a different controller. It's kind of odd, and to me it would make a lot more sense if you could reuse these operation IDs, because it would, to me anyway, it would make sense that the checks controller would have a get, put, delete operation inside of them. But yep, as of right now anyway, you cannot have a unique or non-unique operation IDs. So these will be unique for now at least. But hopefully that will change with the next version of the Swagger tool. Below that we have the tags, so we just define which tags this endpoint is going to fall under for documentation purposes. So in this case, it's going to fall under the checks tag. Down below that, we have any security overrides that we want to issue. So for a majority of the paths, you're not going to see this, but in this particular case, we don't require the user to be authenticated to test the check. It's just returning a static string, and it's used for integration testing, so we don't really want to authenticate a user account in order to test that. So this is basically just saying that you just have to provide an API key to access this endpoint. Below that, we have the different response types. 200 is the only response type that this particular endpoint is going to return. And you can have a description of what that response type actually means. In some cases, you'll see errors. Yeah, so you'll see some errors. You'll see some other descriptions. This is an open field, so you can enter whatever your description of what that response type means to this endpoint. Below that, we have a schema with a reference. So this is referencing some definition that is elsewhere in the Swagger definition. At the very bottom of the file, we have all of our definitions. And this just seems to be the standard practice that Swagger recommends, is putting your definitions at the bottom of the file. So just like the parameters up at the top, definitions is set up almost exactly the same way, except for it's called definitions. We have the name of the definition, the fields that are required inside of the definition. So unlike parameters, we're actually going to be describing multiple parameters or multiple properties. So of the properties, an error message is required. The properties that exist inside of the error definition are code. So there's some property named code, and it has to be of data type string. Same thing with message, data type string. Let's find one that's not. So something that's more complicated is to-dos. So to-dos is actually a definition of definitions. So to-dos consists of an array of items to do definition. So if we go down to to-do, to-dos is an array of to-do. To-do has two required fields. They're description and completed. However, it could also have due date, which is not a required field, but may exist when returning a to-do. So yeah, you can see some of the different data types. So you can do a data type of Boolean, number, date time. So date time is actually a format. So it's going to be returned of type string, just like if you've ever returned a date from a database, it's actually just a string. But it formats it against the Swagger definition of date time. And you can check the Swagger documentation on the Swagger website for what the other data types are that they support authenticating or validating against. So that brings us into another little kind of side story here, is that Swagger does validation for you. I wouldn't trust it as the only validation, so we should still be doing validation inside of the controllers. However, it will do validation on this. So if to-do doesn't come back with a completed field, it's going to fail that. If to-do comes back with a completed field and the value is the word hello, it's going to fail validation because it's not a Boolean type. So it will check for types as well as required. It'll also check like min and max values. So in the case of this load balancer definition, we have a field called load count that's of type integer and has a minimum value of 1. So if it's provided with a value of -1, it's going to throw an error. If it's provided with a value of hello, it's going to throw an error because it's not an integer. Yeah, so it's kind of nice that Swagger is doing that for us. Uh, so while we get back into the paths here, so we just went over a complete path. So Swagger is going to create this route to /check on using the verb get inside of Express. So we don't have to do any other wiring or plumbing inside of Express to actually get to that. And if I open up Postman, you can actually see that running. So there are some other tools that are like Postman. I think Paul's is probably the next most popular, but I like Postman. So if we do a get check, we're going to send over an authorization key. Actually, we don't need to send it over for /check. An API key of it's a data variable inside of Postman. So let me just check to see what that actually is. So we're sending over an API key of test token, which right now we're just checking against a static string to make sure that that's there. So if we send this over, we'll just get a message of node rental core. So there's no actual data coming into this path, so I can't show you the validation for that path, but you can on some other paths. So let's look at this /Couchbase ID. Actually, let's go to a to-do because there's a lot of those. There's a lot more paths around the to-dos. So /to-dos, there's a lot going on here. So we're defining two verbs, so you can get to it, or you can get it, or you can post to it. All of them are going to be using the same controller, so the to-dos controller. Operations, so we're doing get to-dos with the get verb, and create to-do with the post verb. Incoming parameters. So I didn't define a parameter for this. We certainly could have. However, I know that this is the only path that you can actually pass this information over inside of the query parameters. So this is name over do. So unlike path, this has to exist in a query. So if we do, so that means that it needs to exist like that, and in this case, we'll go true. And yeah, I'm not authorized because I haven't authenticated yet. But, yeah, so overdue is being passed, needs to be passed over as a query parameter. Description of just what this parameter actually is, whether it's required or not. In this case, it's not. It's data type. Same thing with completed, and then Q, which is query. So this is actually just a string that will look up all to-dos that match that a portion of that string on the description field in the database. So let me really quick just authenticate against this. I'm going to create a user. I'm going to log in, and I already have all the data set up to be passed over for this, so I can just do it really quickly. Let me just add that key so it gets passed over. And let me just post some to-dos really quick because I don't think there are any. So we can do get /to-dos, and it's going to return all of them. But we can also send over, let's do completed equals true. This is going to be a terrible example because they're all the same. So let's do go for a walk, and it will be false. So let's go false, and we should just get one response. True should be 3 responses, yeah. If we send over something like that, we'll get an error. So message, not a valid Boolean, so it's telling us what data type should be or is expected to be, and then it's telling us what we passed over as well in the message. So some form of that might be used for to display to the end user. So in to-dos, we have 2 response types. We have a 200 response type. We also have a 500 response type. And actually we should have added a definition for 400 response type as well, which is going to be of type error as well. So I could do this one of two ways. I could either set each of these response types manually, like this, or if I didn't want to, I could say that this is actually the default. So in this case, any response type of type response 200 other than 200 will use this schema. Any response type of response type 200 will use this schema. So I personally like to actually list them out. It makes, for me anyway, it makes it a little bit easier to write the unit tests if you have them all the different response codes listed here. You know that when you write your unit test that you need to test for each of those response types or response codes. But of course that only holds true if you're writing your tests after you're actually writing your code. Some people like to write their tests before they write any code. I personally prefer to write the code and then write the tests to test the code. Usually it helps me find some bugs inside of the code while I'm writing those tests. But that is not specific to Swagger. So let's see really quick. So this is another kind of case with Swagger where we're handling a parameter that's being passed over inside of the actual URL. So in this, you see that we have two verbs, get and delete. So parameters, we're actually using that to do ID definition that we defined up above. That is, there's it right here. So that's just an ID field inside a path with a value length of between 1 and 11, or a value of between 1 and 11. So response types, yeah, this is all standard. I mean, this is the same as the other paths, response types of 200, 404, and 500. But yeah, like as you can see, the description does not need to be error. And that's just a helpful description for the actual documentation. That's not going to be something that gets pushed into the actual validation message if it fails validation or something like that. So just know that's strictly, these descriptions are strictly for documentation purposes. Yeah, so now that we've actually seen this definitions file, let's look at the actual documentation that it created. So let me just refresh this. I don't remember if we made any changes that would affect the documentation or not. So when you go to docs, you're going to see a list of the tags. You can either click on one to expand it, or you can actually expand all of the, the same thing. You can expand all of the operations, and that will actually separate out the verbs, the paths, and show you the actual documentation about that path. So in our case, we're going to do one at a time so we don't get overwhelmed by too much coming up on the screen at once. So the /users path, so this is our description of that path. So /users. So that's our description of this verb and path. Response type, so our expected response type is 201. So that's what we see here, a response type of 201, and what the description of that response type is. Down below, because we're using a definition, we'll see the actual expected data type, or data format. So this is a post, so we're expecting the user to send over an ID, an email, an updated at, and a created at. Updated at and created at aren't necessary. In this case, I know that they're not necessary, and I believe that they're not required fields. If you look at this, yeah, required field, not updated at and created at. However, because we're using this definition for our return user type, it includes a number of fields that aren't required for passing over, and we should see that. Yeah, you see that here. So you see what is expected to be passed over there. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the response. That's why that's why it's showing all of this. Yeah, because it's going to respond with all of this information. We're not expected, and we can't pass over the ID field when we're creating a user, of course. Response content type, so if there were more than one response types, they would show up here. In our case, it's only JSON in the case of this, but you could certainly have XML or something like that here. as well. So down here is where you can actually try this out and send data over. So this text area field, you can see you can type into it. So we're going to do test.test.com and then password, we'll do test pass. Right now, if we tried this out, it wouldn't work because it's expecting an API key to be passed over as well. So I will show you exactly how to do that actually in 1 second once we get through all of this documentation screen here. So description of those parameters, which you should see in wherever the users stuff, where is /users again? Yeah, so you'll see that in this definition, or this description field. Parameter type, so where we're expecting it. If we were expecting it inside of the path, we would see parameter type of path. Data type, so this is actually showing us the model. So this is based on that definition that I showed you, what is expected to be passed over. And the default is showing you the example value, and I find that more useful than seeing this model view, especially since we're dealing with JSON. Just like up above, we could have multiple data types coming in. These are the response types going out. So there is some separation of that. So you could only accept JSON coming in, and you could send out XML and JSON. Other response type messages that are the unexpected type messages are 400. So that's an error, and that's defined here. And then just like up above, we see the value of what that's going to look like when it comes out. You can also set up mock values where you'll actually fill in what these are. So instead of saying string, you could have, say, Bob, and you could have the message say Billy Bob. But I think it's actually more useful to see the data type here than it is to see mock type data, where the numbers would be something like this, where it would say 1, and then Boolean would say true or false. I find it more useful to see that it actually says the data type. So let's test this. So you'll notice this red exclamation point. That means that there's some type of security authentication that needs to be completed before we're actually able to proceed. So if you click on this, you'll see the available authorization types, and you can fill in what the API key is supposed to be. In this case, if we were on a different path that required both an API key and user authentication, you would see both of those. So let me see. I don't remember what the actual test API key is. Test token. So let's fill that in with test token. We can authorize it, and it does a page refresh, so you have to type that in all over again. But you'll notice that now it's no longer an exclamation point, but more an informational icon. So email test.test.com, and then a password. If we didn't include a field that was required, it would throw an error. Doesn't really matter. Just type whatever. Try it out. So this is going to send it. We'll get. So this is what it actually executed. Where it hit, we'll see our response. So this should match the expected response types. We see that. Response code, so that should match our expected response code 201, and then the headers that were included. Probably not super useful for this, but when you're doing something like posting to user login, there is data that's sent back. The actual authorization token is sent back in the headers, so that is definitely useful. So if you don't want to use Postman, or if you're on a machine that doesn't have Postman, you can use the documentation user interface to actually test out all of the API calls. So let me expand checks. So check/Couchbase is actually using a controller that's not the check controller, so that's kind of interesting, or different at least from the majority of these. So we'll see like check/check path is using the checks controller, whereas the Couchbase one is actually using the Couchbase controller. So you don't necessarily need to put all of your endpoints under the same controller to match their package. Yeah, because in this case, it makes sense to put the Couchbase checks in the Couchbase controller and not necessarily the check controller, which checks is really just a controller that's being used for node-specific things and not necessarily project-specific checks. Yeah, so that's pretty good overview, I think, of the Swagger UI and how we're using it. I mean, once the project is really getting developed, this is going to grow immensely. And I believe there's some add-ons where you can actually add some search functionality into this. I'm not 100% sure on that. So really quick, let's just go over a controller and how it's set up. Just really brief because it's fairly simple. So you'll notice we're using JS doc for documentation, code documentation. So you'll see JS doc comments throughout this. So for Swagger to work, you need to export the module names in an object, and they need to match up to some type of function inside of the module. Swagger provides the request and response data types to the functions, so you can expect those. There is one kind of weird hackiness with the user authentication, or the security authentication. Swagger does not pass over the response as a separate data into the function. It actually passes it over inside of request. So you'll see that we're passing request.res as the response, which is kind of weird to me. I'm not sure why it doesn't pass it over separately, but it doesn't. So just, yeah, that's not an error. That is why it's like that. Yeah, maybe you want to comment here because it's kind of weird. But to the actual endpoint paths, it does pass over request and response. Yeah, I mean, outside of that, you can do whatever you would normally do inside of the Express framework. Yeah, just make sure that you're exporting the actual module, or you're exporting the actual functions in the modules to be referenced inside of the swagger.yaml file. So yeah, so that is my overview of Swagger and what we're doing with it. So yeah, if you have any questions, either ask or there may be some future videos that pertain a little bit to Swagger, but are covering some other area.